Good evening, and thank you for joining us at the Massachusetts Historical Society for this evening's program. My name is Dr. Robin Pearson, a new trustee here at the MHS. I'm honored to welcome all of you, those joining us here in person, as well as those with us virtually. The strong interest in tonight's conversation is reflected by the fact that over 550 people have registered to attend online. Whether you are joining us virtually or in person, if this is your first time visiting the MHS, I'd like to extend a special welcome. We're an independent, nonprofit organization that maintains a research library with an amazing collection of materials. We hold close to 14 million manuscript pages and tens of thousands of artifacts, with special strengths in the American Revolution, the early Republic, and the 19th century America. For the past 230 years, we've been making our collections available not only to academic researchers, but also to grade school through graduate students and to intellectually curious members of the general public. We also host a wide variety of programs like this evening's. Our annual schedule of events will continue through July before we take a brief break in August. A short pitch for your support. We're only able to provide access to our collections and host programs like this evening's talk thanks to the support of our members and our generous donors. If what you find here interests you, we hope you will return for future events and support our work by becoming a member. This evening, we'll hear from Dr. Ned Blackhawk. Dr. Blackhawk is a graduate of McGill University. He then received his master's in history from UCLA and his PhD from the University of Washington. He served on the faculty at the University of Wisconsin-Madison from 1999 until 2009, when he was recruited to Yale as a professor with tenure in the history department. In the past 2 years, Dr. Blackhawk has been further honored as the recipient of 2 different endowed chairs at Yale, the Lamar Chair and the Towson Chair. In addition to the book he'll be talking about today, Dr. Blackhawk is the author of Violence Over the Land, Indians and Empires in the Early American West, published in 2006. That study of the Great American Basin, which lies between the Rockies and the Sierras roughly, garnered a half-dozen professional prizes, including the Frederick Jackson Turner Prize from the Organization of American Historians. He's a proud member of the Western Shoshone Nation, which gives him particular standing regarding the subject of that book and today's talk. This evening, Dr. Blackhawk will be in conversation with Dr. Andew Marsh, who is a professor of political science at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and earlier taught for 10 years in the political science department at Yale. They'll be speaking about Dr. Blackhawk's latest book, The Rediscovery of America, Native Peoples and the Unmaking of U.S. History. This book is a sweeping and overdue retelling of U.S. history that brings to the fore how interactions between Native North American communities with first Spanish and then other European settlements shaped both the native and colonizing cultures in pivotal ways. It describes why knowledge of Native American experiences and cultural influences are essential to understanding the evolution of modern America. In particular, Dr. Blackhawk's synthesis of these interactions leads into what one critic, Alan Taylor, described as an eloquent and moving story of Native American recovery during the 20th century. It's an honor to host Dr. Blackhawk and Dr. Marsh tonight. Please join me in warmly welcoming them to MHS.
Thanks for that great introduction. Thank you, all of you, for coming in person and on Zoom. This is a real honor and privilege for me. Ned and I have been friends for about over 10 years, but more. Our teenage kids were in school together. They're downstairs avoiding this talk right now. So that's how we first met, even though we were also colleagues. So this is not only a great intellectual pleasure for me, but also a kind of, something I'm very, very happy about personally to be here with Ned tonight. Ted's a tremendous scholar, one of, if not the most influential historians of the Native American experience writing now in America. And I think we're all going to have a really, really scintillating and eye-opening discussion over the next hour. So first, I would like to just invite you to talk a little bit about the origins of the book. Your first book, Violence of the Land, was a very, very specific study of a certain history and place in the Western United States. Can you talk a little bit about how the idea for this book came about, the origins of it, the inspiration. It's a book of extraordinary scope and ambition. It is a effort to sort of redefine the field, stake ownership over the entire field of Native American history. So can you talk a little bit about where the book came about?
Well, thank you for that generous invitation to offer some reflections, and thank you all for coming both in person and virtually. And thanks to Olivia and to the whole team here at the Historical Society for also organizing tonight's hopefully productive evening. This book, as I often reflect upon, reflects a lot of both personal as well as kind of intellectual experiences and ambitions. I'm not quite exactly sure where to begin, but generally speaking, I've modeled it on a series of what I consider to be kind of foundational syntheses of certain types of American history that I read earlier in my career and found incredibly useful. And I've spent much of my teaching and to a lesser extent administrative career kind of helping to build certain approaches to Native American history, and have always kind of seen the need for a kind of interpretive overview of the field for both pedagogical and scholarly purposes. It may be hard to really comprehend because Native American history is obviously the oldest field of American historical inquiry, but it lacks in many ways much of the requisite academic infrastructure. And so it may be hard to realize that there's not actually a kind of commonly used kind of single volume synthesis, or at least there hasn't been until very, very recently in the field. And so that kind of need has always been kind of present in my teaching and kind of intellectual life, as well as in kind of personal encounters with colleagues or friends, neighbors who say, I'm really interested in Native American history. What should I look at? And I usually used to recommend fiction, right? So I used to say, read Louis Erdrich or Leslie Marmon Silker and Scott Mamede, some of the great Native American writers, to really, if you really want to understand Native American, like the experiential nature of Native American. But then over time, and that's where the title of this book comes from, there's been an incredible outpouring of scholarship in this field. I've witnessed and lived through and in some small way participated in an outpouring, a kind of prodigious kind of scholarly both conversation, but also a reorientation that has happened, what kind of some social scientists might call a paradigm shift that has kind of occurred in the study of particularly early American history, in which a field that used to be criticized for knowing more and more about less and less kind of literally exploded in the last 25 years to create what Taylor and others might call a vast early America that is not bound by the Atlantic. It's not only Anglophone. It's not only British North America. It's a continent of imperialists and indigenous peoples, newcomers, African-American slaves, people coming together upon the American continent in which a kind of continental perspective is necessary. So that kind of profusion of scholarship that has kind of occurred in the last 25 years or so, I call the rediscovery of America. That we have kind of lived through or kind of come to this point in our nation's history where we can attempt to think about the history of North America from at least this field's kind of perspective and vantage point.
I have a quick, very, very quick follow-up on something that you said in passing. You said that Native American history was the oldest field of historical inquiry in America. Now, I want to make sure I understand that, because that actually comes as a surprise to me. Are you saying that academic historians in America first devoted their attention? Okay.
Well, I would say it's the oldest field of American history.
Okay.
So it predates the arrival of Europeans, obviously. And,
I see. Okay.
And it's also, in certain ways, one could say it is the oldest subject of American historical inquiry. If we think about the exploration narratives of the 1500s, the kind of narratives of settlement, which are often obviously about settler communities, but the interior worlds, the indigenous traders, allies, hosts, figure prominently throughout the kind of study of American history. And part of the introduction to this book makes a strong kind of strong critique of the field for not really understanding this sufficiently well. And so I'm trying to get to a point academically and intellectually, if not kind of socially, where we can have a kind of broader conversation about the history of the United States, the history of North America, that is not siloed into kind of segmented fields of inquiry, but kind of more of a kind of unified whole of some kind.
Mhm. So you describe the book as a synthesis, which points to the indebtedness that you have to this 25 years at least of inquiry, and of course going back further. Would you say that the book at the same time has an overarching thesis or argument or narrative thread? So beyond just sort of synthesizing the work, it ranges, from the beginning of contact to the present, all around North America. But in addition to this narration of events, would you say that there is an interpretive framework or thesis that guides the introduction material that people here today and readers should be aware of?
I think there are a series of hopefully identifiable themes that kind of unify the whole. And it's particularly evident in the book's structure. And so the book is divided into two parts, part one, part two. And each part is 6 chapters total. And part one ends essentially with the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, or ends in 1787 with the drafting and ratification of the Constitution, the place of Native Americans within that process. And then part two, so that's the end of part one, which is entitled Indians and Empires, and surveys the Spanish, French, British, North American, and kind of particularly the imperial crisis of the 18th century from the vantage point of this field. Part two is called Struggles for Sovereignty, and it's basically a history of federal Indian affairs and relations since the founding of the United States. So each of those parts then have a kind of thematic emphasis, one on Indians and empires, about the centrality of indigenous peoples to all of the colonial settlements and imperial worlds that are established across the North American continent. I can't obviously chronicle and survey or interpret or synthesize all of those subjects, but do so in these kind of discrete chapters, each of which I hope offers some intervention or kind of overview. And there's a chapter on British North America, at least in New England, on the history of Puritan settlement, essentially. So that those halves essentially have their own kind of thematic orientations. So the first half would be a kind of familiar emphasis, as the kind of field now recognizes upon the dialectics essentially of indigenous and imperial relations. The second half is more political and legal in a sense that it highlights the kind of changing forms of American law and dominion and kind of subordination of Native Americans throughout largely the 19th century, and then focuses on how Native Americans across the 20th century have largely responded to and or at times reshaped those doctrines and practices into our current era. It's a kind of remarkable history that hasn't been, I think, sufficiently recognized, in which Native American communities over the last 100 years, and particularly over the last 50 to 60 years, have really found forms of autonomous self-governance that really are kind of unprecedented in the history of the United States more broadly. So those are the kind of themes, somewhat kind of specialized interpretive conclusions, we might say. But if the book had a central thesis, it's that it's impossible to understand the history of the United States outside of its indigenous past. And each chapter, each section is essentially intended to prove that. And so even a commonplace subject like the history of the United States in the Second World War, the history of the United States during the Cold War, the history of the New Deal era, the history of the Progressive era, all of these kind of paradigms or fields of analysis that have conventionally or continue to conventionally organize American historical inquiry are themselves inadequate or incomplete without a reckoning or kind of a recognition of this field. And I'm happy to give kind of particular details about that if you'd like or if needed.
So that's actually what I was going to turn to next. I have two sort of parallel companion questions. And the first is, we're all going to read the book. So we're all going to learn this. But in advance, as a bit of a teaser, what would you say are the biggest falsehoods or misconceptions, things that we think we know about Native American history that are not true and that we will be disabused of by reading the book?
Well, since next Tuesday is the 4th of July, and we are sitting not too far from Boston Harbor, I think it's really one of the kind of central imperatives of the early parts of this book was to lay to rest a kind of hagiographic celebration of the founding fathers' kind of ideological origins as the exclusive understandings for the origins of the American Revolution. In certain audiences, that I might get a little bit of applause for saying that, certain scholarly communities, but there has been a kind of deeply entrenched, overly celebratory kind of recognition of the ideological origins of the American Revolution, as the famous book by Bernard Bailyn has termed it. And the kind of the theories of republicanism that have kind of guided us, generations of scholars for understanding the kind of political culture and ideology of the origins of the United States, they failed on a fundamental level to understand the concomitant kind of anti-Indigenous currents that were also at play in the Revolutionary era. And I was sharing some documents with your daughter before we came in about this period, and was telling her that, or was showing her that the Declaration has in it as its last concluding grievance against the Crown, a concern that the English Crown has incited merciless Indian savages to attack our frontier communities. And if one studies this Declaration and its history, one would kind of come to see that the final grievance is in fact the most important. And like there's 27 grievances in the Declaration, and the last one is essentially the climax or crescendo of the entire document. And the last grievances were the only ones that the Continental Congress actually re-edited from Jefferson's original 29. And so scholars like Jill Lepore, most recently, or most perhaps in certain ways in the field of early American history, have written about these subjects in her famous book, These Truths, A History of the United States, without mentioning that the Declaration is simultaneously inciting violence against Indians. And where does that history come from? And I could kind of lay that out if we wanted to, and that's what chapter 5 does. So one thing to kind of emphasize that central theme of the first half of the book is that Indigenous peoples were so central to obviously not just the formation of these imperial colonial worlds, but to their ultimate evolution. And we really can't or shouldn't think of them outside of these worlds that is outside of these contexts, because you can't understand how in July 1776 the founders of the Continental Congress lodged these concerns into their chartering document that authorized independence without understanding where those sentiments came from. And those sentiments came from interior communities that were heavily aggrieved because of the British Crown's policies of relative appeasement or diplomatic negotiations or economic subsidies towards Indigenous tribes. And there's a whole dark history of anti-Indigenous thought and practice and violence throughout the 1760s and 1770s that hasn't been sufficiently incorporated into kind of narratives of our nation's founding. That's a real important kind of intervention I feel was needed. And it's related to the need to then think of the history of the Constitution and the centrality of Indigenous affairs to the formation of the early republic in similar ways. And those are a little slightly more technical, understanding like where Indians appear in the Constitution and how those clauses and phrases and ultimately form larger doctrines of law and policy, but they're related because Native nations were such important and at times determinative historical communities within the imperial crisis between England, initially in France, and then England and its colonists, that we've just really been unable to see this world sufficiently well, in my mind.
So related to that, did you write this book in any way with the wider history of settler colonialism and other settler colonial projects, Canada, Australia, Israel, in mind? So was the rewriting of American history informed by the idea that the United States is less an exceptional nation that founded democracy in a particular way, but is part of a certain kind of phenomenon of settler colonial displacement and founding of new relationships to land and place through the displacement of native populations, a topic that's transformed my field of political philosophy as well as history? Were you informed by the broader increasing understanding of settler colonialism as perhaps one of the defining features of modernity from the 1600s?
Yes and no. There have been critiques of American exceptionalism that predate the kind of settler colonial turn that were kind of foundational to my own academic or scholarly development. And those critiques were coming largely out of the field of American studies, which is not just history, but also literature and kind of cultural studies of various kinds, were very present throughout the late 90s and early 2000s. But they failed to really grapple with the indigenous history of the United States in this. And so settler colonialism gave many of us a kind of vernacular for continuing those critiques and incorporating some of their key themes. And it's not incoincidental that the revolution chapter that I just mentioned, or chapter 5, is entitled Settler Uprising. And it looks at these settler communities, particularly in Western Pennsylvania, who are totally at odds with the British Crown over their Indian policies in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War. And the idea of a settler uprising kind of is referencing the kind of growing capacity of essentially settler colonialists, if we were to use this academic term, their growing presence. And then chapter 7 is called The Deluge of Settler Colonialism, which is essentially a history of the early republic and the kind of just demographic, economic, and profound kind of social turbulence that much of Eastern North America experienced because of the prodigious kind of growth of British or formerly British North America into the interior portions of Eastern North America. So clearly I'm engaged in this, and there's some great books that are kind of, and studies and articles that are kind of part of this paradigm that you referenced, and many Native American studies scholars are deeply participating in the kind of directions that this theoretical field is going. I'm a little hesitant to embrace some of these paradigms fully, and because they sometimes flatten the historical distinctions and uniquenesses between and across wide-ranging subjects. And so one of the important books that I drew upon pretty heavily was called Replenishing the Earth, which is a global history of settler Anglophone settlement, which I think mentions in 1790 there are roughly I think 20 million English-speaking people in the world, but then by 1930, there'll be 200 million. And so that kind of history of demographic, what the scholar named Jamie Bellich calls settler booms, we need to understand. And so he periodizes the history of 7 major Anglophone settler booms and begins, ironically or not, with a heavy critique of a book about Chicago that has been incredibly influential in my field called Nature's Metropolis by actually my former colleague, William Cronin. And Nature's Metropolis is this kind of beautiful history of Chicago's just extraordinary growth in the aftermath, in particular of the Civil War. A city that I think had 20,000 pigs in 1850 has 4 million by 1880. And these are animals, not So he is some Nature's Metropolis explores this kind of the hinterland, the infrastructure, the agrarian kind of Western territories of timber and grain and hogs and other resources and steer and cattle that make their way to Chicago, making it Nature's Metropolis. And so that book, which just profoundly influenced the history of Western American history or historiography, Bellich takes issue with and says, look, Chicago grew like that, but so did Melbourne. And so were other kind of Anglophone settler communities around the world. So we need to think of them less in a kind of exceptionalistic and nationalist way, but in a comparative way. So I'm very kind of appreciative of this kind of paradigm, but also a little concerned that we lose particularly not just the historical variations across these historical and kind of various continental experiences. We're also losing at times the kind of centrality of indigenous agency to the making of these worlds. And the settler colonial turn, as you know, emphasizes the process of indigenous elimination as a central feature of the kind of Anglophone Commonwealth nation state formation across mainly the 18th and 19th century worlds, which is, in certain perspectives helpful and true, but it's also in certain ways also less helpful because we lose sight of the fact, for example, that North America had more people in 1492 than it does in 1776. And that's not because of settler colonialism. That's some other historical history of colonialism more broadly, diseases and warfare and enslavement. And so if we can't think of those things as connected with settler colonialism, which we should, then we're going to just fall back on a somewhat truncated field of analysis that reinscribes the importance of nation states rather than seeing the kind of longue durée influence of peoples and places, and in particularly the unanticipated outcomes, things like minor skirmishes that become wars or certain political strategies that become movements. We kind of lose the kind of historical contingency as well. So I'm very appreciative of this other colonial paradigm, but also kind of aware of some of its limits.
Well, having said that, to stick a little bit with the settler colonial question, so there's a certain kind of story, let's say, that's popular in political theory or political philosophy that says that there are differences between the settler colonial ideology of Protestant North America from Catholic Spanish South America, and that one of the dominant justificatory ideologies for settlement in North America is kind of, derived from Lockean conceptions of property, right? By what right do we have to settle here? They're not making arguments about natural law or are the natives human or not? It's, well, we have colonized the land. We've taken land that was in common. We've mixed our labor with it. We have now an entitlement to property. So that's a kind of a broad story. Would you say that there was a single dominant ideology of settler colonialism throughout U.S. history, or various different ideological projects and justifications at various stages in various places for various purposes?
Yeah, I think I'd say more of the latter than the former. And so I do agree that there's a kind of particularly distinctive Anglophone Protestant kind of ideology that ultimately, particularly by the Jacksonian era, has established the kind of well-recognized discourses of what we would call, or what has been called, manifest destiny. That is the kind of providential, the predetermined necessity, if not outcome, of the United States to become a continental empire and to subdue and or civilize the indigenous populations there. There is, however, a 50-year period of undetermined pluralisms of various kinds and mutualities that is really at the heart of the early Republican or of the early republic in ways that haven't been sufficiently recognized. And chapter 7, which is kind of a survey of this period, attempts to kind of highlight this kind of growing power of particularly a Jeffersonian vision of agrarianism that will be at the heart of the American expansionary project.
I mean, doesn't Jefferson say at one point that
Those who labor are the
as long as Native Americans are settled, as long as they're turned into farmers or something like that, in our sense of the term, they can be incorporated into Virginia. Is that wrong? Or?
I think in Notes on the State of Virginia, he has a kind of long meditation on the presence of Native peoples within the colonial world. And one of the interesting things that chapter kind of revealed to me, and as did some of the work of scholars like Ibrahim Kendi, that his ideas about race are still in formation. And the Haitian Revolution, 1791, the Jay's Treaty of 1794, the Naturalization Act of 1790, which is the first time the term white is codified into U.S. statutory law, and the Militia Act of 1792. These are events that kind of form this decade of kind of growing racial consciousness that he may not have intended to essentially adopt or reckon with, but was forced to. And so the reason I mentioned the Jay's Treaty, for example, is that he didn't really believe that the Senate should have that kind of exclusive power before he was president. But as he becomes president, he starts realizing it's a great thing to have that kind of power if you want to acquire access to, say, the mouth of the Mississippi, and the French are offering to sell you the whole region, and you don't actually need a constitutional amendment. And so they passed the Louisiana Purchase Treaty without having to kind of amend the Constitution. And so there's the kind of formations of kind of policy that bring sometimes coherence to incoherent spaces. And so over time, I actually see the Declaration and the Constitution as ideologically kind of disparate approaches to a similar problem. The Declaration incites or kind of condemns Native peoples as merciless savages. And savage, as you know, is not just a kind of form of racialized distinction, but also kind of a form of uncivilized kind of classification that will eventually kind of compel many state leaders to feel that their kind of moral obligation to impose institutions of civilization upon them. And so there is an incredible period of indeterminacy that is starting to take formation by the time Jackson comes into office and begins the removal policies of the 1830s. It's a somewhat technical history that may not be super familiar outside of historians of the early American Republic or the antebellum or Southern or Native American historical experience, but it's not in coincidence. You'll see these kind of divides kind of consistently and recurring throughout this era in ways that seem episodic, but are kind of part of a larger kind of history and phenomenon. And Jackson, as you know, is at odds with the Supreme Court justice in the Cherokee Nation cases in the 1830s. And so even in their disputes, various kind of philosophies or ideologies of Indian policy are still kind of in formation and often in conflict.
I have a few more things I'd like to invite you to talk about before opening it up to the audience. One of the things I had wanted to ask about, since we're here, are some of the New England, Massachusetts particularities. Anything that you'd like to comment on? One thing that occurred to me is that maybe this is what you sort of meant by the settler colonial paradigm not taking into account indigenous agency. So if you think about things like the King Philip's War or the 7 Years' War, you know that there were natives and settlers on both sides of the conflict. It wasn't always just settler versus indigenous. And so you can say whatever you'd like about that, but I was wondering, is there any sense from your research that things could have been different, that there were some settlers that came without the desire of complete sovereignty and conquest of the land, which necessitated either the removal or the subjugation of indigenous populations? Was there a sense in which there were some moments in American history or some visions of settlement that would have allowed for a different mode of relationship to the land, relationship to native populations, relationship to sovereignty and governance? Or am I just being a little...
That's a really interesting question, because it highlights the kind of multi-imperial emphasis that the field now has taken. And so there are academic historians like myself who specialize in certain regions or imperial settings, or what we might even call borderlands histories. And we come to understand those particular uniquenesses pretty as carefully as we can. And in that kind of variation, you can start seeing then alternative practices, contrasting experiences and philosophies. And in certain ways, the kind of history of the French Empire in North America has become seen as, in many ways, the most kind of mutually determined of the 3 or 4 or 5 major kind of European imperial undertakings. And so much of this book's early half reflects that emphasis in the literature. Within the British Empire, one thing I was really struck by was the relative fragility of the Puritan colonial experiment or settlement pattern until the early 1630s. And so even though it's maybe only a 12 or 13-year period, chapter 2, which is on the British Northeast, or the native Northeast and the rise of British North America, really attempts to provincialize the kind of Puritan colonial history, in part because it has been so heavily kind of institutionalized as the kind of antecedent of American history more broadly. And this is like still in kind of historical perspective, New England still remains the most heavily studied region in the United States because of the Puritan, because of the antiquarians of the 19th century, the rise of colonial history, the kind of deeply often celebratory history of the Revolution and the founding leaders from the region. It was only in like the 70s that Southern history kind of broke away from the kind of the hold that New England held on what was then called like the American mind. So anyone in the field would know these kind of historiographical moorings, essentially. So it's hard to even emphasize how kind of synonymous in many ways colonial New England remains with early America or the origins of America. And we still have metaphors in common day life that would express, the city on the hill, the kind of first Thanksgiving. It's just, most Americans have a hard time like putting things in historical perspective. It's hard to hear and kind of make sense of the fact that, the first British colony to endure was founded 13 years before the Puritans came. We just don't know much about that early history of Jamestown in ways that we should. But so it was really kind of an attempt to provincialize, in a sense, that kind of proprietary hold. And so I spent a lot of time mainly reading the works of other scholars to kind of see how they exposed a whole range of developments that heavily shaped the eventual outcome of the Puritan settlement of New England. And so those emphases are things like the enslavement of indigenous peoples from the region, the transport to England, the enlistment of them in kind of creating cartographic and kind of ethnographic understandings of the region, the return of those people, including to Squanto, who is at Plymouth, having returned to North America, having been already transported. There aren't that many identifiable indigenous peoples from the region who are in England before Puritan settlement, but there are dozens. And so it's hard to kind of realize that there are, in fact, indigenous people from the region already in England before Puritan settlement. So it's just, and it's partly because the first British, mariners are here in the 1500s, they're here in the early 1600s. And then that history of
we tend to think 1620 or 1607,
right.
The coast of Maine right over there has forts from 1520s, right? I mean,
maybe not forts, but trading posts. Cartier's on the St. Lawrence in 1634. Verrazano is in New England in the 1520s, and his journals are published and translated. And it's not like this information isn't available. And so I actually began chapter 2 with Verrazano, and his Chronicles of Block Island, which comes to have a central feature in this chapter, is evolution. Because what happens in Block Island in the 1630s kind of eventually leads to the Puritan conquest of New England through the during and after the Pequot War. And so the Pequot War is really in many ways the kind of culminating denouement of the chapter 2, and that kind of represents the eventual solidification of a vision of Puritan settlement that was not actually in existence initially, and that the British were not in the 1620s and even early 1630s envisioning the same levels of a kind of regional imperium that they eventually established. And it's partly because of the influence of diseases both before Puritan settlement and before the Pequot War. There are these two major pandemics in 1616 and then 1632-33 that just so radically destabilize indigenous worlds that the British are able to then envision and initiate a kind of conquering of their kind of primary indigenous rivals and the subordination of them that leads to the kind of forms of land ownership, the Lockean kind of property owning kind of political reality only becomes possible in certain kind of contextual ways.
I'm going to ask one more question. So I'd like to get people to start thinking of their questions. And it goes something like this. So for a lot of us who are not professional historians, advances in historiography are very often presented in the public as ways of understanding the present. So the 1619 project, for example, the big thing that came up in you can explain the public transportation system in Atlanta because of 1619. So anyway, I'm not disparaging that. Do you, in the book or either on your own, want to leave us with any kind of suggestion that there are certain aspects of our politics today, our political culture, our political fault lines, certain aspects of kind of preoccupations with issues on the part of certain Americans that can be still today traced to our settler colonial origin, whether it's the obsession with guns, whether it's hatred of history, right? Why are we so uniquely opposed to teaching our own history? Not just DeSantis, but many, many people. Obsession with land and property. But I want you to answer.
Well,
I'm saying,
those are
something you want to leave us with as well, that you bring Native American history up to the present, but is there also something about the political culture of America that you think means that colonization settlement is still going on and is still a feature of, as you derisively said earlier, the American mind?
Well, I was maybe being derisive of the historiography.
Yes.
And this is funny because you're basically asking me whether whether the work has within it a kind of potential continued indictment of
or explanation
or of the American historical experience writ large, in a way that might limit what I still see are some of its potentially, if not optimistic, but hopeful sentiments. And so I'm actually more kind of, just in a kind of personal perspective, hopeful that we can transcend some of our ideological or partisan or regional or certain types of differences by seeing commonalities and shared unifying themes more broadly. And I think Native American history allows us to see certain things in ways that are unfamiliar and in strange ways also kind of reassuring. And Indian policy in particular over the last 70 years or so has in many ways not been heavily dominated by one or two of the dominant national parties in the United States. And it is something that Native Americans themselves have been so kind of consistently advocating and trying to shape and impact and modify that it's not really intelligible in a kind of red or blue or kind of conventional kind of political paradigm. I think that's healthy in a way, because I think it shows that this concern has been one of the unifying themes of these communities for so long that they've enlisted often numerous allies, national leaders, supporters, other constituents into a kind of struggle for, we might say sovereignty, we might say, some might say indigenous liberation. It's a way in which these communities have tried to use certain constitutional principles, legal doctrines, international law, public consciousness, certain types of militancy to change a kind of national current. I think those stories are more perhaps inviting or have spaces for entry than maybe some of the more potentially leveled criticisms that this subject could also still deliver if needed.
All right, I'd like to open it up now at this time. Gentleman right here.
Thank you. My question really has two parts. One, you spoke in the beginning in a very broad sense about looking at the whole two continents, North and South America. And I remember reading a book a number of years ago about Champlain, and I got the impression he had a fairly different approach to dealing with the indigenous people than some of the English settlers at the time. So my first part of the question is, do you have a broad distinction, let's say, between English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese? And then my second question is, I know in Latin America, you had like very large indigenous empires that covered large territories. To what extent did the indigenous people, let's say, communicate amongst themselves, let's say to coordinate amongst the opposing, the incoming settlers?
Mm-hmm. There is a kind of hemispheric perspective that opens the project with the chapter on, I hope it's not too presumptive, but chapter 1 is called American Genesis, Indians in the Spanish Borderlands, which is an attempt to kind of highlight the kind of centrality of Spanish and Iberian influences upon particularly the Caribbean and Mexican worlds prior to Francophone and Anglophone exploration. And this is somewhat conventional historical emphasis in the field, but still isn't like very heavily sometimes recognized. So there's a lot of synthetic surveys of these types of histories that kind of highlight how Spanish kind of partial island colonization up to like 1517 kind of is radically expanded by the Cortesian conquest of Mexico by 1519, 1521. So that kind of history then leads to the settlement of central Mexico amongst the great Nahua or Aztec Empire and the sets of negotiations that kind of form the kind of, the nucleus of the Spanish Empire. That nucleus expands north throughout the 1500s, eventually arriving into the Southwest in full force by the 1590s, laying the seeds for the first American colony, New Mexico, North American colony. So there's the kind of emphasis on these kind of continental or hemispheric developments that distinguishes this world from others, other colonial worlds. And also puts in, I think, into, I don't want to say sharp relief, but it puts into conversation the enduring presence of Pueblo Indian communities in this region's history. These are the oldest continuously inhabited spots on the North American land, the Pueblo nations of New Mexico and Arizona. There were roughly 81 by archaeological estimates by the time the Spanish arrived. 36, I think, by the time of the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, and I think 22 today. So they've undergone just tremendous changes, but nonetheless have endured and adapted and responded essentially to the challenges that you're suggesting. The level of communication between these indigenous worlds is really hard to ascertain outside of the presence of European chronicles and documents. There is a kind of concern with this project that it's in certain ways dependent very heavily on Euro-American textual productions and archives, and much less on Native American origin stories or cultural teachings, some of which are heavily influenced in certain areas more than others. So this is not by any means a kind of comprehensive overview, but a kind of hopefully a useful, and if not needed, undertaking towards these concerns.
Hi. So contingency seems to be like a very important idea in your book, and something that I've found like kind of disappointing or frustrating with other narratives about this period of history is that like everything was a foregone conclusion. You know, there was a lot of disease, 99% of people died, and, you know, it was all just a matter of time from that point on. So I was just wondering if you could elaborate on that sort of idea in this point of history.
The history of disease is an essential feature of Native American history, and in many ways has become the primary or a primary mechanism for telling the early American historical experience writ large. Some scholars have been able to piece together like the epidemiological history of communities that highlight that demographic diseases were not exclusively the cause or sole origins of these communities' challenges, but they were, as we referenced perhaps with the Puritans, they were one of many ordeals that Native American communities had to endure in the presence of these other kind of imperial or colonial challenges. And so I'm kind of, I think, pretty assured that at no point does the disease kind of argumentation overpower these other contingent explanations. It's one of many kind of colonial disruptions that unmake essentially Native American communities, and shouldn't be seen outside of the context of these other disruptions. That may be kind of a broad answer to your question, but it's a pretty big subject. The diseases of the smallpox epidemics of the 1780s, affect indigenous peoples from Mexico up the Mississippi and Missourian world, up into the Northwest coast, up into Hudson's Bay. Like literally the whole continent has a history of disease that is a necessary factor in understanding its subsequent development.
We have a question online from Michelle, who asks, in response to your point about anti-Indigenous sentiment and actions among the founding fathers, what do you hope to see in conversations, interventions, and public events for the upcoming 250th?
Well, I would hope that many of our readers and listeners might kind of take it upon themselves or feel somewhat motivated to try to answer these questions themselves. Where do these terms come from? Where does the term merciless Indian savages originate? And chapter 5 has some kind of partial suggestions, but there are others who are working on these subjects. And I would hope by the time we reach 2026 that we as a nation are able to have a more kind of full-throated, but nonetheless still civil conversation about the intricacies of all of the kind of original sins of the United States. that there's more than one. And it didn't occur in isolation, and we shouldn't be competing to prove one versus the other as more kind of foundational. And this is not just about some scholars, but these are like big fields of inquiry. There's a whole field called the history of American racial capitalism now that has emerged, that has kind of seen has been unable essentially to see Native American history and land dispossession as a central factor of the history of American racial capitalism. I think we're going to get to the point where this is not the case, and I hope my book has some small role to play in that conversation. But I'm constantly in conversations with scholars where I'm saying things like, I just can't see how you can, and it's usually like a modifier. It's usually the kind of, and I try to tell my students not to let their modifiers carry their analysis. But you know, if we're fighting over modification, we're losing the battle, right? If you want the most foundational, the most original, you know, the first or the oldest, whatever kind of modification you're trying to prove, is going to not have as much kind of analytical persuasion or depth if we frame it solely in kind of somewhat subjective modified terms. So who are the these are colleagues at nearby institutions who make these claims, and so I often writing and saying, well, there's more than not just one American original sin. There's more than one foundational American institution. And Indian land is necessarily one of the kind of central determining influences upon the motivations for independence.
Right.
I have a question. I'm an educator on the other end, K to 12. So my question, you mentioned something around lack of like academic infrastructure and also the lack of primary sources related to Native American history. So I'm just wondering in general, very selfishly, what advice do you give to educators, curriculum developers trying to bring this work into the K to 12 classrooms with those just challenges that exist?
Oh, that's a great question. And thank you for all the hard work that you do. As a son of a public school teacher or high school teacher who likes to remind me fairly often, she often says, Ned, what you do isn't teaching. And it's true, right? But I do work in certain capacities with teachers and have kind of worked in ways that hopefully are helping modify or rectify these challenges. What I often say is there's probably more information than we realize. And the challenge is how do we access it and what do we do with it? And I often recommend, as best as one can, trying to make sense of a local or regional, like Indigenous history, and if possible, doing so in concert with local Indigenous community members and or tribal members. And so we have two federally recognized tribes in Connecticut, the Mashantucket Pequot and the Mohican Nation, and we try as best we can to involve our classes, if not directly with their kind of cultural offices. We take tours of their museums and have speakers and do things of that kind of nature. I don't know how many. I'm sure many people here have been to the Mashantucket Pequot Museum. It's really an extraordinary undertaking and achievement, and they have a 25,000 square foot recreated Pequot village, and they also have movies that were made to kind of talk about the Pequot massacre from the community's perspective. And so you can learn a lot in those types of partnerships or spaces, and there are now I think over 200 tribally run cultural centers or museums in the country, and ironically or not, Connecticut has both the oldest and largest. And so those are the kind of possibilities, but it takes work. It takes re-education. It's a kind of challenge that awaits many who come to this field, but I think a rewarding, if not at times daunting one.
Well, I'm Newcomb Stillwell. I'm the board chair, and I just at the end of the evening wanted to stand up and thank you both very, very much, and thank everyone for coming here and virtually. I'm sure others feel the same way I do, but this has been a really exemplary MHS evening. mean, we have always been and aspire ever more perfectly to be the home for everyone's history. And we're aspire to be and are the home for excellent historical discourse and analysis. And we are even happier when it involves an innovative perspective on things. So we couldn't be more thrilled to have you here and be promoting what your work. And so thank you for coming. We're also really interested in these guys and do lots of stuff to try and help them. And, just to say it, Robin talked about 14 million documents. They're just riddled with evidence of the encounter between indigenous and settler communities. I mean, we have gobs of it, and it hasn't even begun to be really sifted with that perspective. So there's, I'm sorry.
Is it digitized?
Well,
Small.
that is some. It is, and you would be amazed at how much it costs to digitize a single page. Anyone interested in giving us $100 million to digitize our collection will gladly take it. But no, that's one of the many projects we're working on here. And, as times change and perspectives change, one of the things that changes is the perspective on what are the things that are important to prioritize in deciding what to digitize. Anyway, this has been an exemplary MHS evening. It's just what we're trying to do. And we are thrilled you all are here. And I can't wait to read the book. So thank you.
Thank you.